Nick Rodham as usual. Today we're coming at you with the Star Realms rules overview. We're going to take a look at all the rules for this really fast-paced, really awesome little deck building game. The rules are actually pretty simple. It should be very easy for just about anybody to pick up. One thing I like about this game is that the rule set is so simple, and yet it feels like there's a lot of different ways you can go at winning the game. Maybe you're going to focus on keeping your authority, which in this game is basically your life, but it's called authority. You can work on keeping your authority high and replenishing it, and replenishing it each turn with some trade federation ships who are really good at that. Or maybe your strategy is going to be to keep cards out of your opponent's hand, and so you're going to focus on getting some Star Empire ships because they have a lot of discard powers. Or maybe with the machine cults, you're going to just focus on getting your deck as small as possible so that every single turn you have great ships in your hand. And of course, maybe you just want to really stick it to your opponent, really go after them real heavy, and that's where the blob ships are going to come in. Anyway, enough about that. A lot of that might not make sense yet. Take a look at the rules. You'll see what I'm talking about. When you start the game, you have 50 authority. Now, the game comes with these cards, which I showed in the components video, but you can see it's got authority, 2010, these cards. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to start with 50, and then as you play through, you flip them around. You got 1s and 5s there. And you're supposed to, flip these over and keep track of your authority this way. Garbage. You might as well, for real. I cannot stand those, okay? They're such a pain in the butt. Don't mess with them. Instead, just write it out on a piece of paper, okay? That's the best way to handle your authority. Don't be messing with those cards. So let's get going. Okay, so here we've got the game set up. You can see you've got a player deck for yourself, a player deck for your opponent. You've got the trade deck, trade row consisting of 5 cards drawn from the trade deck, and the explorer deck. In each of your decks, you're going to start with the exact same 2 ships, or 2 types of ships. You're going to have 8 scouts right there, and you'll have 2 vipers. And of course, these will be shuffled up. Mine are obviously not shuffled up right now, but they'll be shuffled up, and then you start the game with that. And like I said, your opponent will have the exact same ships in his deck. Also, next to your trade deck, you're going to want a spot for a scrap heap where all of the scrapped cards go in the game. Now let's go over a little bit of the iconography real quick. Up here in this corner, you're going to have your faction icon. In this case, it's the Trade Federation. You'll also see up here that they're going to have the name of the faction and the designation of this particular card. So this is a Trade Federation base. Obviously, you've got the name of the card up here. This is the trading post. In this corner, you've got the cost of the card. So in this case, it costs 3 trade. This symbol right here indicates authority. For this particular card, you can gain 1 authority, or you can gain 1 trade for this card. This symbol indicates the amount of combat you can gain from the card. This right here indicates that that this card has a scrap ability, and in this case, the scrap ability is to provide 3 combat for your trade pool. Over here, you can see that this base is an outpost, and we'll get into what that means in a little bit, and that this base has 4 defense. Again, we'll explain that a little bit more in a bit. So what are the 4 factions in the game? You're going to have the Blob faction. You can see this is a trade pod belonging to the Blob faction. You've got the Machine Cult with their patrol mech ship here. This is a Dreadnought belonging to the Star Empire. And this is a Federation shuttle belonging to the Trade Federation. And each of the factions has their own special abilities, or I should say they each have a focus towards a certain special ability. You can find a little bit of everything in each faction, but you'll find the blobs are much heavier in doing massive amounts of damage. The Machine Cult is very good at discarding cards, which of course is important as far as paring down your deck to get some of that fluff out of there and get the more powerful ships in your hand every turn.
The Star Empire is good at drawing cards and also at causing your opponent to discard cards. And the Trade Federation is really good at replenishing your authority and providing a large quantity of trade for you to deal with.
When you begin the game, the first player will draw 3 cards into their hand. And these will be the cards that he starts the game with. Meanwhile, the second player will draw 5 cards. Now, after the first turn, every subsequent turn, the first player will have 5 cards in his hand again. But drawing 3 to begin with is kind of a way to offset any advantage you might get at first pick of the trade row. During the main phase, you can play any and all cards from your hand. And to be perfectly honest, I think you almost always will play all cards. And you'll just put them out in front of you. And you'll see in this case I've got 3 trade and 2 combat. Let's say I played the Dreadnought, however. When you play a ship, their primary ability must be used immediately. So in this case, I'd gain 7 combat to my combat pool, and then I'd draw a card. I then am allowed to use any ally abilities or scrap abilities available. Now in this case, he has a scrap ability indicated by this icon here, but no ally ability, which would be indicated, as on this card, with a faction icon down in the card description. I also can use any trade that's in my trade pool to purchase cards from the trade row. And I can use any combat in my combat pool to attack my opponent. Some ships have this faction icon down here, which, as I've said before, indicates an ally ability. Well, how does an ally ability work? When you play another ship of the same faction, so let's say I then play this Dreadnought, you can see that both of them are of the Star Empire faction, which means that where before this ship had 2 combat and caused your opponent to discard a card, now that you've played an ally of the same faction, this ally faction ability is going to trigger as well, which means that now instead of just 2 combat, you have 4 combat from the Imperial Fighter. Most card abilities, such as the 2 combat and target opponent discards a card, can only be used once per round. And once it's used until the next time you play the card. However, a few cards, such as Mech World, have static abilities. In this case, Mech World counts as an ally for all factions. Now that ability is constantly running. It doesn't have an end until that base is destroyed. And so since Mech World, in this case, counts as an ally for all factions, even though it's a machine cult base, it still counts as an ally for the Star Empire ship Imperial Fighter, which would trigger this ally ability here. When a card provides you with combat or trade, as the Missile Bot and Survey Ship do, you add those to your combat pool or trade pool immediately upon that ability being triggered. It's important to note that some cards let you choose between 2 or more items, such as in this case, add 1 authority or add 1 trade. Be sure once you play this card, or any card like it, that you make it clear which of those you're going to use. There are 2 different types of bases in the game. You can see this is an outpost, and this does not have the outpost designation. What this means is an outpost basically guards you and your other bases from attack. An outpost must be destroyed before anything else can be destroyed. If you have multiple outposts, your opponent can choose which outpost to attack. However, all outposts must be gone prior to damage being done anywhere else. You can see this outpost has a defense of 4, which means that 4 combat must be dealt to it before it is destroyed. At the end of your opponent's turn, any damage that was dealt to the outpost that didn't destroy it is repaired. In this case, 4 damage must be done to the outpost in a single turn. Likewise, with the blob wheel, if your opponent chose to attack it, because since it's not an outpost, they can choose whether or not to attack it, 5 damage must be done in a single turn to that base. Now let's talk for a second about scrap abilities. The Imperial Frigate, when it first comes out, is going to provide 4 combat and cause your opponent to discard a card. However, if you choose to, you can also scrap the Imperial Frigate, which means it's going to go into the scrapyard, as opposed to your discard pile, which means it no longer can be used. However, in doing so, you will gain the draw a card ability, which lets you draw a new card out of your deck to be played this turn. Keep in mind that when a scrap ability is used, you still get any other abilities that were triggered during the turn. Some cards, such as the supply bot right here, have the ability to scrap cards in your hand or the discard pile. Also, you'll find some cards, mainly for the Blob faction, allow you to scrap cards in the trade row, though not exclusively for the Blob faction. So with this card, its ability will trigger as soon as you play the card because it's the primary card ability. And let's say I would then choose this Scout in my discard pile, place it over here in the scrap heap, and it's gone from the game. With the Explorer, it's a bit of an exception to the scrapping rule. Whether you use the Explorer's scrap ability or if it's scrapped by another card, it does not go into the scrap heap. Instead, it goes back over here to the Explorer pile to be used again. So let's say these are the 5 cards I play from my hand. You can see I have 4 trade with the Scout, the other Scout, and the Supply Bot. And I have 2 combat with the 2 Vipers. So now I have 4 trade in my trade pool and 2 combat in my combat pool. And with that, I can look up here and see which cards I want to purchase. And let's say I decide to take this Corvette. So that Corvette, as you can see, has 2 trade value, which means I now have 2 trade left in my trade pool. As soon as a card is purchased, you immediately flip over the next card, put it in the trade row. Well, now I have 2 trade left. I could buy that Imperial Fighter, but maybe it doesn't interest me. So instead, I go over here and buy the Explorer, place it in my discard pile as well, because anytime you purchase something, you can see there's the Corvette I just bought. It went into my discard pile. There's the Explorer. It goes into my discard pile. With the 2 combat that I have, I can look over there and see that my opponent has no bases out, specifically no outposts. So I would be able to deal 2 damage to him, which would reduce his authority by 2. Let's say, however, my opponent did have an outpost. You can see that the battle station has a defense value of 5. And since I only have 2 attack, because keep in mind, this ability is not triggering because there's no Machine Cult allies out here. So I only have 2 attack. The 2 attack goes up against the battle station's 5 defense. Nothing happens, and no combat damage is dealt to my opponent. However, if instead I had a patrol mech and I chose to use the 5 combat that he has there instead of the 3 trade, that would mean that the supply bot ally ability also triggers, which would give me another 2, so that's 7, plus 1 for the Viper, that's 8 damage. I could then attack my opponent. I would destroy his battle station, which would cause it to go into his discard pile. And that absorbed 5 of my attack. I had 8, which means 3 damage is dealt to my opponent. So after the main phase, we enter the discard phase. You're going to discard all the ships that you have out into your discard pile. Any bases you have will remain where they are. Any trade left in your trade pool will disappear. Any combat left in your combat pool will disappear. If for some reason you had cards still in your hand, those would go into the discard pile as well. Finally, you enter the draw phase, and you'll draw 5 cards. Now you'll notice I only have 4 cards left in my draw pile. So I draw those 4. I would then reshuffle my discard pile, and after it's shuffled up, I would pull 1 more off the top in order to get the 5th card into my hand. Once you have your 5 new cards, your turn ends immediately and your opponent begins his. Hey, Baker here from the editing room floor. I forgot to sign off, so thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about the rules in the comment section below. And be sure to like my video if you liked it. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you like the channel. And be looking for a gameplay video. I'm hoping I'll have it out in about a week. So anyway, thanks for watching. And until next time, if you're bored online,